actually is to jumpstart the process and to get people off the grid. To have people put in solar and put in batteries and get off the grid, and to actually form the entities or take existing companies or take new companies and figure out ways of financing such that homeowners and renters pay less of a bill under putting the solar and the batteries than they're paying now. And they can gradually pay down the cost of the energy system and just leave the grid. So that's what we're promoting. So I'm wide open for questions on anything to do with energy.
What will happen when more and more people leave the grid? Are they going to still have their plans to do what they're planning to do?
Probably in the short run, large hotels which claim that they can't open their windows to take advantage of the trade winds. And for some reason they can't put solar on top of their tall buildings. They will want to stay attached to the grid, and they can pay the higher rates.
Is it possible to get a building permit and a residential building permit in the state of Hawaii without any power restriction? If a person wanted to live without any electricity in any form?
As long, I'm not sure of the county regulations, but part of the problem is if you stay connected to the grid as a backup, if you say, what happens if our system goes down and we're going to stay connected to the grid, so in case something goes wrong at our house, we can still get grid electricity. The utility will have to charge you for that. And that's why we're proposing a clean break. There are different regulations. I know on Oahu, for example, a few people have put in small wind systems on their roof. And the county has now come up with a new code that you can't put wind systems on because it will go above the height limit, and you can't. That's just not.
I think you breezed over her question. Can you ask the question again?
I don't know the county regulations here.
I think it's important for us to consider the possibility. I'm attempting to go in that direction where I'm not having to play that power game at all. I mean, if we think back some period in time when people didn't need solar, wind, or electric, and they were still able to get by, how difficult might that be to legislate that as a possibility?
Well, first, if we remember the fight over Red Road that occurred here in the Puna district, where a solar community had second homeowners come in, and a few of them wanted then to hook up to solar, and there was a court fight.
You mean hook up
to the utility. I'm sorry, hook up to the utility. And the courts ruled that the community had to elect the power lines in. The problem, and I'm no less sure on Oahu, but in the state, the legislature is controlled by the utility. So you're not going to go, there are some people like Faye back there who are really fantastic. But by and large, the utility controls enough people within the state legislature that you cannot pass a law at the state level to be unfriendly to the utility. I do not know enough about the county. I do remember meeting with Billy in his office a few years ago and talking to him about geothermal. And I asked him if I could take his response on geothermal, and he said no.
I know the answer to that question. The county building code requires you to have electrical inspection, and to get a final on your house, you have to have X amount of plugs. You have to have, your house has to be wired to get a final.
And so you can have a generator, a gas generator. You either have to have a gas generator or a solar system to get your code.
To get a final.
To get a final. Yeah,
to get a final, but to get the permit without the final, you can get.
Oh, to open, well, you can open a permit, but they're not going to give you a final unless you have your electric.
Even if you say you're not going to have any electric in your house, the code requires to have a fire alarm system, and without that, you're not going to get your house to pass. They got you coming and going.
Yes.
And my question was, deals with that very realm right there. Our recent Building Code 270 that was passed right there seems to have cemented us into the PUC. What is it that we can do to really try to amend that to make it so that it's more solar friendly and more off the grid friendly?
What I'm going to be working on in the next few months is under state law, Helco has a monopoly for the utility for electricity on this island, but they do not have an exclusive monopoly. Any other company can come in and also be an electric utility within this county, independent of Helco. There could be many of them. So the question is, can you create a utility that would focus on securing the financing to help people get off the grid? And that's not that unrealistic. Years ago, all energy efficiency programs were part of the utility, the electric utility. So Helco would finance solar water heaters, energy efficiency systems, and we argued that that was stupid because here you were paying the utility to increase their use. They make money by selling electricity, and they were also being paid to get you to reduce your demand. And the way that worked is every $3 you gave them to help them get people to reduce demand, they spent $1 actually reducing the demand. They gave $1 to themselves. They gave $1 to their their executives, and it was a huge rip-off system. So we proposed that they separate energy efficiency from reducing demand to energy sales. And that's why the PUC set up a separate company called, unfortunately, Hawaii Energy, that now is a utility, a subsidiary of SAIC out of San Diego, that offers energy efficiency programs. So you have one utility that will sell you electricity and one that will help you to reduce your electricity. You need a third one that will help you to get off the grid permanently. So that's possible, and it can be done, and I'm going to be working on the mechanisms.
How does the public utility on Kauai work? I read recently that they're not part of the HEI conglomerate.
Hawaii Island Utility Co-op is really fascinating. It's fascinating because most electric co-ops in the United States use coal for power, and there are just distribution lines and customers. There are some co-ops on the mainland that generate, but they don't sell to customers. So you have mostly co-ops that sell to customers. These co-ops own other co-ops that generate power. And Kauai Island Utility Co-op was the first co-op in the United States that generated power and sold it to customers. At the time they were formed, they were not registered with the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs as a legitimate business. They had no government, they had no utility expertise. They used the same lawyer as the company selling them the utility. They agreed initially, and I don't know about the final document, but in the draft document they said if a Superfund site is found at Port Allen, our major generator, and it was caused by the people who are selling us the utility, we will assume total financial responsibility for it, and we will not be able to tell our own members about it without their permission, even though they no longer own the company. And they borrowed money from the federal government to pay for all of this, and they overpaid for the utility. So I would not go with the KIUC model. I think there are far better ways of going. But that is an example of a co-op in this state, and KIUC is regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, but the commission has said because they're a cooperative, there'll be far less regulation of them and far more trusting that they do the right thing because their members and their customers are the same people in general. And the reason HECO is regulated is because their shareholders and their customers are generally different blocks.
If the idea is to get off the grid and retract the grid, is it really a good idea for the public to buy that grid?
I don't think it's a good idea to buy the grid. I think it's a good idea to dismantle the grid and to dismantle the major power plants. If you look at the utility generators throughout the state, and you say which are the 3 highest polluting plants per kilowatt hour of energy produced, 2 of the 3 are the Helco's Puna plant in Kayau and Helco's Hill plant in Hilo. They were grandfathered in to be really toxic emitters. We need to shut them down.
I was wondering, you were suggesting grid, but suggest we need storage and batteries, or something like that. Can you expand on that? How would that work? I mean, where are we in terms of battery storage, and what do you anticipate in the next 5 years or so?
We anticipate hijacking a federal study.
Let's go for it.
First, Murdoch on Lanai submitted a draft environmental assessment for his Lanai wind farm, and then he withdrew it in favor of DBED coming out with a environmental impact statement preparation notice for the inter-island cable. That they totally blew because they looked at only big wind on Lanai and Molokai powering Oahu, and then when they got 200 responses, including from federal agencies, state agencies, county agencies, and nonprofits saying you're required under federal law to look at alternatives. They then went to the state procurement office and said, you know, we made a mistake. We were supposed to look at alternatives. Can we get some more stimulus funds, non-bid, that we can give to our contractor so they can do a more decent study? And the state procurement office said, guys, this is federal law. You should have known that. No, you can't. So now that process has been canceled, and now the U.S. Department of Energy is going to attempt the 3rd time to do an environmental impact statement for the cable to Lanai, Molokai, and now to Maui. They have, under federal law, the environmental impact statement is required to look at alternatives, even if there's no funding mechanism for them. They're beyond the scope of the agency proposing it, and even if it violates federal law, as long as it's a reasonable alternative. Getting people disconnected from the grid is a reasonable alternative. So, we merely have to get the federal environmental impact statement on big cable to look at the alternatives which they're proposing. 1, wind on Lanai and Molokai. 2, wind on Maui. 3, geothermal on Maui. 4, islands each solve their own problems using solar and wind on their own islands. And finally, disconnecting from the grid and getting everybody to be their own power generators. So we get the federal government, require them to follow federal law and look at that as a viable alternative. And part of it is we know the environmental impact statement preparation notice is coming out in about a month. At least that's the latest table that DBED and others have been telling us. So we need to develop our alternatives with sufficient specificity that we will force the federal government to take it on as one of the alternatives they look at.
There you go.
But what about batteries?
There are a number of batteries that can be used right now. There are lead-acid batteries, for example, that people can install. Their home. The question is, what is the relative cost of the battery versus the cost of the smart grid and the billions that the state utilities are going to be paying in? And I realize that I could give a detailed analysis of what I think the cost impacts are of grid-based versus non-grid-based. But once I start saying that, it's going to be based on all kinds of assumptions, the discount rate, the interest rate, and all kinds of things, and the utility will then shoot at it and say your assumptions are wrong. So rather than my proposing how I think it will be, it's better to let the federal study come out. Right now, there are about 3 dozen tests around this state being done on batteries. They're being done by dozens of companies, and the utilities involved in them. They are dealing with on-site, on the power plant side of the meter. They're being done on the grid-based side. Part of my reluctance also in getting into it is the Public Utilities Commission created something called the Reliability Standards Working Group. It's an attempt by the Public Utilities Commission to upgrade reliability standards statewide. And they handpicked about 24 people to serve on this working group. The PUC appointed me as one of the people on it. I have signed non-disclosure agreements so that I can see some of the internal data being done, but I am not allowed to publicly discuss it. And therefore, some of this gets into the technical issues that go beyond to the other side of the non-disclosure agreement. So it's better to lay out a case in the environmental impact statement process and to let the federal government list the costs of different ideas.
Henry,
Yes.
so what you just said, I'm going to translate for myself. Evidently, if the EIS statement on the cables going through into the island are specifically interested in stopping anything that would harm the marine life in Wales, that this is going to actually be the criteria to stop that cable from going through?
I think that's one of the major stumbling blocks they have to deal with. Right now, you can't go to the north side of Molokai because the canyons, the undersea canyons, are too deep and too close to shore. You might be able to go to the south side of Lanai. You can't go between Molokai and Lanai because of the marine issues. There's also the question of how to bring it ashore on Oahu, because it's easier to bring the cable to the south shore. But on the south shore, both the state and the county and the military have been dumping all kinds of toxins there. And I know this because I served 9 years as community co-chair of the Hickam Air Force Base Restoration Advisory Board. I currently serve on the Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam Restoration Advisory Board. So I've seen some of the maps of where the toxics are. The north shore to Oahu is simpler, it's steeper, so it presents one problem, but the simpler solution is you bring it to the marine base. And therefore, you get certain federal regulations that say when you bring it to a marine base, you don't have to follow certain of the restrictions if you didn't bring it to a marine base. So we know the endpoints on Oahu. It's not clear what the route will be to Maui or to the Big Island. The whale sanctuary is certainly one major way, but the other ones are the technical difficulties of bringing it to the Big Island. The massive number of transmission lines you need to connect it to the east side. The massive industrialization you would need in the Puna area. Whether right now PGV digs a new well each year. So they dig a new well, they have half a dozen wells that produce energy. They have 3 or 4 injection wells where you put the waste back into the ground, and each year they try to find new ones. If you increase the size of the plant 30-fold, is the resource there?
No.
And even if it's there today, will it be there in 10 years? I mean, you build all the plants and half of them don't have functioning wells in 10 years, you have a problem. Then there's the problem of the cost. If the cost of solar right now on Oahu is less than the cost of making the renewables anywhere else and bringing them to Oahu, why wouldn't you go with Oahu? One of the things PICO has said to us is Oahu lacks renewable resources. I've heard that from David Kaufman. I've heard that from Billy Kanoy. I've heard that from Hawaiian Electric. I've heard them from state legislators that Oahu lacks resources. And I said, look, how many people see all these tourists on the Waikiki beach? They go up on Diamond Head, they look out at the Waikiki hotels, and they don't see any solar. You're saying that it doesn't exist? And so there has just been a study that showed that the recoverable wave energy off Oahu, recoverable, U.S. federal study, the recoverable wave energy off Oahu can power the island tenfold over. There is enough solar to power the entire state